3. Here we have response number 3 with many admirable ideas, but there are a few corrections we need to make in this to bring it more into practice with the Baroque period. Leaving the first measure alone is just fine. Again, you're changing the other measures, showing variation after the first measure. That's fine. The leap of the tritone is a little bit awkward. You do occasionally see these leaps in Baroque music, but for the most part you want to avoid those. Leaps that are difficult to sing may be ones that you need to not use in your composition. So that's a little bit awkward and should probably be revised here. This articulation, slur to, tongue to, is almost never used in the Baroque period. In fact, I have trouble thinking of where I've even seen that articulation. It would make much more sense to slur these 3 adjacent notes and then tongue the third. That is a very common Baroque articulation and brings out the fact that you've got three notes that are stepwise, one with a skip, slurring steps together, and then tonguing skips would be a very good idea there. Now this last measure I flagged not because it's necessarily wrong or bad or anything like that, but actually I find it really quite interesting, and it does work quite well. Now we have a D major chord starting in this measure here and presumably continuing on into this fourth measure here in this example, but there's no reason why you can't vary that a little bit. The author here has a D major implied chord, I guess on the downbeat, or perhaps the A goes there, but then has this A arpeggio then leading back to D. And actually this works pretty nicely in this context. The A chord leads back to the D, this being a D7 chord, which then resolves back to the G major chord, the 1. So this is a nice idea of some merit here, and I just wanted to point that out for you. Okay, now on to response number 4. Well, here we have one of the most innovative of the responses, certainly adventuresome response to this compositional problem here. This composer took our first measure, did some variation on it with the lower D here. We move into the second measure, moves nicely with steps, trills. Notice with it being approached from above, you don't need to have the appoggiatura on this trill, so leaving that off is really a good idea. This is quite unusual to go to the upper A. If there is any weakness, it's the fact that I usually reserve the higher register for later in the composition rather than introducing it early on as a way to show more of a climax later on. But this is really quite expressive. Then we end this last measure with nice articulation here, nice slurring. There's one weakness I found here is you have a lot of eighth notes, you have a lot of motion going forward, and then all of a sudden we stop on this one beat. It's better to have longer value notes in the beginning, and as you come to the end of your segment or the end of phrases or the end of the piece, to make the motion move forward, and it just seems to be a bit of an abrupt halt here, which I think with either eighth notes or maybe 2/4 notes could be very, very easily fixed. This is a very nice response and really has a lot of merit. Okay, let's go on to response number 5. Here we have response number 5. This does a good job of varying with ornamentation, the given line. We've got some changes to the first measure. We then have a repetition of the first measure with further development. See how these two sort of naturally lead. The third measure here seems to hearken back to our first measure. We then have some variation. And then the fourth measure has the most complication of all. You can see how eighth notes move through to the last trill here. So this is a very strong response. If there's any weakness to this response, it's the fact that all of the ornamentation is done through arpeggios or arpeggiation. This is fine for these 4 measures, but if all the ornamentation in this movement is just arpeggiation, then that will be very, very boring. So you do need some stepwise motion mixed in there at time, but this is a very strong response, shows a lot of creativity to it, and would work really quite well. Well, I hope this has been helpful, that you can see different ways in which you can ornament. Understand there's necessarily no right or wrong about ornamentation, but there are better and there are worse solutions, and you want to find solutions that are, well, historically viable and expressive and bring forth just the very best of your playing and your personality. Hope you've enjoyed it. God bless you. Bye.